So this is really just a quick rerun of a keynote I gave this weekend to a doctoral research conference, and it's based upon some emerging ideas that I've been developing over the last 2 or 3 years, and is focused on the idea of thinking through organisational change, but thinking through organisational change from what at the moment I'm calling a complex process angle. And in this particular talk, looked particularly at organisational change in relation to teaching and learning, or pedagogy, or whatever you want to call it, within higher education. The premise that I'm starting this on is from thinking through what I would see as being some of the shortcomings, some of the problems that we have currently in education. And whilst I'm mainly talking about higher education, I think it's as equally true for schools as well. And that the underlying, or at least some of the underlying problems of the system at present is down to the fact that organisational management, first of all, is very much beholden to a form of managerialism, where there becomes a sort of a managerial class that often sits above the work of the organisation and is very much focused on outcome data and a very narrow set of evidence as to how well an organisation is doing, and which also becomes very much focused on levers such as marketing and image and unique selling points, rather than necessarily really focusing in deeply on the nuts and bolts of the processes that need to be working really well, core processes such as teaching and learning. And this is very much linked to this idea of reductivism. In other words, that we've got very, very complex organisations with a multitude of different processes, all of which are constantly interacting with one another in different ways. Organisations obviously made up of large numbers of people who all have perspectives, etc., on things, and yet what we time and again do is just boil those complexities down to a few key numbers and a few key league tables and sort of very simplistic numeric frameworks. And therefore, organisations, particularly in education over the last 20-30 years, have been in a double bind of managerialism underpinned by this idea of reductivism. And as a consequence of that, we get simplistic accountability structures where, again, numbers are very important. League tables become very important. So we now, particularly in higher education, if something moves, then some kind of league table is slapped on it, as if it has almost a level of legitimacy because it's a league table rather than what it's measuring or how it's measuring it. And sort of the most recent addition to this sort of hyper-reductive complexity reduction process is the teaching excellence framework, which predominantly doesn't even bother measuring the thing that it's actually meant to be interested in. And as Halachmi sort of wrote back in 2014, that all of these structures are about making accountability transparent, making everything transparent and accountable to the public. And actually, the paradox at the centre of that is that actually all of these approaches can actually end up undermining and creating problematic situations that undermine what it is they believe they're interested in. And in a past presentation, I've likened this idea of over-reliance on numeric data, over-reliance on outcome data particularly, as being one of working with the shadows, that actually we're not looking at the organisations in their complexity, we're not looking at the organisations in their very holistic complex form, what we're actually trying to do is go through a radical complexity reduction process to knock out all that complexity and just pretend that somehow we have a full picture from a few numeric results. And this has sort of gone on for probably 30 years now, this sort of general approach, and it's actually deepened, and there's been lots of self-congratulation amongst some within sort of the sector that actually what we're now doing is creating far more intelligent numbers and better numbers, but ultimately they're still just very reductive numbers. But if you begin to question, and if you begin to suggest that there might be a different way forward, something very different, then actually you're seen as being sort of somewhat odd or some kind of radical or fundamentalist. And Chandler and Reed sort of take some work from Collas and mention this in their book on the neoliberal subject, that actually what this sort of narrative has attempted to do is stop people imagining something different, to stop people imagining that we can do something different than what we have at the moment. Because if you suggest it, you're just seen as some kind of crackpot, or you don't understand, or how could we possibly do anything else than what we do, because it's always going to be a lot worse. However, what I think we do need to do is start off by just thinking about what we're actually dealing with in terms of organisations and the creation of organisational changes within the educational sector. On the whole, we're talking about large organisations. Those large organisations have a multitude of different processes, relationships going on. They're non-linear much of the time, and therefore we are looking at true complex adaptive systems. We're looking at complexity. These organizations are not simple linear processes. There's a lot of variety amongst these organizations, both between and within them. And over time, any single organization, and certainly different organizations, will have shifting aims and objectives. We're talking about a set of processes and moving targets, and there'll be different philosophies and values. And even within a single organization, there'll be a multitude of philosophies and values. So teachers, for example, will almost naturally have different values and philosophies. We don't all agree in doing things in exactly the same way. So when we're looking at change, we're not looking at a simple process of going from A to B. We're not looking at sort of saying, well, okay, we're doing this now and we want to do this in the future, and this is just the simple way in which we're going to do it. There's a lot of competing tensions, competing processes, etc. And therefore outcomes might be important. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we shouldn't consider outcomes. You know, things like kids' exam results are important. But what we have to spend far more time on and far more energy on is actually the process side of things rather than the materialistic. We need to think about the processes that might get us there, to think about whether or not the processes we're using now are the right processes or the wrong processes. And therefore we need to begin to work in ways that do actually focus far more and enshrine far more the importance of processes. But interestingly, even now, and I certainly think this is the case, particularly within universities, I think there's a lot of different practice within schools now, but in a lot of educational organisations, we're still talking about very hierarchical organisations, and in some of those organisations where there is a lot of hierarchy, it also means that the senior leaders are very, very remote, that actually they perhaps don't go to large parts of the organisation on a very regular basis. They don't necessarily speak to people on a regular basis across the organisation. And when I say speak to people, I don't mean in terms of state visits. I do actually mean just informally. And therefore, I think one of the problems that we have in large parts of the education sector is that managerialism has brought the rise of the philosopher king. And what I mean by that is the sort of Platonic idea that senior leaders can be or see themselves as being cast in the position of being the people who know, the people who understand, the people who can strategize and formulate ideas, surrounded by their guardians in the senior leadership team who, if you like, in a sense, are the enforcers. Once the philosopher king has spoken and has decided on a course of action, they then go forth and ensure that the plans are put into actual sort of being. And everybody else in the organisation, certainly sort of, either classroom teachers or lecturers in departments, are just seen as being the artisans. They're the people who don't really understand, can't think for themselves particularly well, and really just need guiding, and therefore are very much the people who carry out the executive orders, carry out the projects, but they actually have very little, if any, voice in terms of creating them. And one example of that, I think, is in things like strategic planning, where very often in schools and certainly very often in universities, any kind of annual plan is actually formulated away from those at the bottom of the organisation, for want of a better expression, and are just sort of given out as pearls of wisdom, as being the areas that need to be focused on. And yet it's the teachers and the lecturers who are involved on a day-to-day basis and have a wealth of expertise, wealth of experience, wealth of understanding of perhaps what needs to happen within an organisation to take it forward. And yet they certainly strategically, they have very little voice. And interestingly, I think one of the things that demonstrates this approach to management and leadership is that in education, for example, we have a very large area of research into management and leadership that is actually divorced from other areas to an extent. And it's interesting that if you go to something like organisational sciences, then yes, leadership is important, but it's actually an element of organisational discourse and organisational research. It's an element of the organisation, rather than an education where much of the strategic thinking, much of the strategic research is in this sort of cocooned area of management and leadership. An organisation takes a very distant second place to that, and sort of seems to mimic the disconnect between the philosopher kings and the rest of the organisation, in a sense. I think with this in mind, we then need to begin to think about the nature of change, because experience seems to suggest that change is something that is constantly happening, and yet is potentially in many educational organisations really not understood as a collection of processes in any kind of coherent way. It's not. Change is something that happens, but it's not something that is necessarily particularly well understood. And the diagram on this slide is really just to make the point that when we're trying to bring change within an organisation, this is just one particular model. It's based on some work that Ivor Roth and Helen Kurtz use in their book in 2016, is to show that actually we need to think carefully about the kind of change that we're attempting to develop. We need to understand the kind of change. It's not good enough just to say, oh, we're going to bring change, and then begin the change as if that's it, really. You just decide you want to change something, you decide on a timeline, you decide on some aims, and then you get on with it. We need to begin to think about it in a far deeper sort of organisational and cultural fashion. Because change within large organisations, again, is often complex. It involves a lot of people. It involves people making different senses out of what's actually presented to them. A lot of that change is having to occur in lots of different contexts. And what that kind of narrative also forgets is that we've got to think about whether we're talking about planned change, for example, a specific project, perhaps with explicit aims and processes and timelines, or are we actually talking about emergent change? Change is something that happens all the time. within organisations, but emergent change, because it happens at the bottom often, and is something that only happens in small groups, is often not shared, it's not often not captured, it's often lost to the organisation, even though some amazing things might be going on, because actually in the fog of trying to carry out all the planned change and trying to carry out an ever increasing amount of accountability processes, real opportunities for some very positive change are often lost. And therefore, I think we need to just stop a little bit and think, you know, what kind of change are we trying to create here? Are we trying to create deep, really well thought through, perhaps piloted, complex change that is going to be embedded and really begin to improve practice? Or are we just wanting very surface level changes that are good for collecting medals, that are good for getting baubles and league table positions, but actually don't bring any kind of fundamental or deep change to the organisation? And how much change, for example, is done just to look busy, to make it sort of, for example, a case of pushing through change by somebody senior in an organisation to ensure that they can show something on a CV for when they're going for their next promotion. And I think one of the problems with a lot of surface level change is that within universities in particular, where you have quite a large senior leadership team with everybody wanting to push through an element of change, that seems like one thing to each of them. But actually down at departmental level, it could be that there are 5, 10, 15 change projects going on all at the same time, which actually can't be assimilated. And therefore, using the phrase from Baudrillard, are we risking a hyper-accelerated standstill, where we're so busy trying to bring lots and lots and lots of change that we actually oversaturate people, and that means that we get absolutely no real change whatsoever. And therefore, I think one of the difficulties that we can end up with is that we get a massive disconnect from those at the top of the organisation with those from the bottom. And in some cases, that can lead to people at the top thinking that everything's going extremely well, being happy, thinking that they're leading transformative change. And actually at the bottom, people are struggling, and it's all seen as a bit of a wasteland, because actually they can't ever get ahead of the game, and they never feel as if they're doing anything particularly well, because they're just completely overwhelmed by the number of agendas that are coming at them. So the kind of principles, I suppose, that I've been developing in trying to understand organisational change, and particularly in relation to teaching, and here what you'll see is, and I do this throughout the presentation, is I put a series of full stops in brackets after words such as teaching and learning. And the reason I do that is that I find just sort of saying that we're going to try and change teaching to be a wholly inadequate concept, really, because if you're attempting to change teaching, you're not doing it by itself. It isn't about changing teaching by itself. It's about changing teaching in relation to learning, in relation to curriculum, etc. So the idea of putting full stops in brackets after teaching is to try to make the point that none of these concepts, none of these processes ever occur alone. They always occur with other things. And what I've started to develop is the idea of using 3 core principles, really, for thinking about the nature of change and how we can begin to bring change to teaching and learning, etc. And that is that actually we have to accept that we're working with complex adaptive systems. So complexity theory is central to ways of thinking about practice and organisational change. That actually we can argue all we like about whether the reality of the world is idealist or realist, is this, that or the other, but actually at a practical level, the use of pragmatism as a guiding principle for understanding organisational change and teaching and learning, etc., is far more useful. It's about trying to gain evidence about what works within the particular context at the particular point in time, not the work that some people are developing, where there's a belief that one day we can reach some form of endpoint or nirvana, particularly through the continued use of randomized controlled trials, so that we know exactly what approach we can take. We can never do that, because practice and organizational change is very, very much context bound, and therefore pragmatism allows us a way of thinking practically, to size up the evidence that we have at any point in time, to use that as a way forward, but always be open to alternatives, always be open to the fact that there may be better evidence that comes along that we create, or that we're exposed to, that has been created by others. And then sitting with complexity and pragmatism is the idea of process philosophy. And process philosophy very much argues that process is primary ahead of substance and material. So the argument here that I'm using is that if we're looking at organizations, then yes, we want to head towards good outcomes. We want to head towards, for example, good curriculum and teaching materials. We want really good online resourcing. But actually, if we're going to do those things, then it's actually in the processes that we have to be working. We need to understand the complex and ever shifting nature of the processes within teaching, learning, etc., within organizational change, if we're to begin to gain really good insight. So really a complex process approach is accepting that it's the complexity in the process which is central to understanding the kind of thing that we're looking at, and that we're doing that within a pragmatic sort of context, if you like. So thinking about teaching in HE, and even though it's only been published a week, I think already I would argue that we have to move way beyond the TEF, and that's simply because the TEF makes the same mistakes as a lot of other sort of government generated systems, in that it wants simplicity. It wants to be able to actually create a market in education based on a series of really quite simplistic numbers. And a lot of arguments can be made for the TEF around, well, no, it's not perfect, but we need something. But ultimately what that seems to me is arguing is, yes, we know it doesn't work. We know philosophically it's pretty naff, but we've bought in so heavily to a managerial, reductive, marketized philosophy stroke ideology around higher education that we can't even think our way out of doing this and thinking our way into doing something else, because it would undermine these basic principles of marketization, etc. But what I would say is that within this, can we honestly say that the focus is on developing the quality of teaching and learning? I would argue that it absolutely isn't. And that if we are genuinely wanting to give students a better experience, if we're wanting students to learn around their disciplines extremely well, if we're wanting to produce really fantastic curricular and teaching approaches that bring in well thought through assessment frameworks to test that learning, then actually we won't do that through the TEF. In fact, in many ways, the early evidence seems to be that there's a total disconnect between the TEF and those kinds of really difficult questions. What we're doing is going for easy answers rather than actually spending time trying to think through how we produce something absolutely fantastic. If we do want to move beyond simplistic league tables and numbers, then we need to start thinking about the complexity of teaching and all that goes around it. And if we're going to do that more than just sort of one or two people experimenting in their classrooms, in their seminar rooms and lecture halls, what we then have to do is begin to ask serious questions about how we take really fantastic practice and begin to embed it in wider organisational change. actually innovating, actually playing around with and creating really fantastic approaches to teaching and learning, etc., within a seminar room with a dedicated individual, you could argue in some ways is quite easy. How you then begin to get that to stick at organisational level is far, far more difficult. So rather than worrying about whether we're bronze, silver or gold, whether we got the right medal, how much marketing capital we can make out of that, what we need to do is instead get far more serious about creating great environments for teaching and learning. And the first thing that we need to do around that is, rather than calling it a teaching excellence framework, which sort of picks out the teaching element of it, understanding that teaching never occurs in isolation. It's innately intertwined. It's interpenetrating with learning, curriculum, assessment, etc., and the work of students and teachers. And to try to reflect this, recently I had an opinion piece published in an online open access journal, the Aldine Journal, where I've sort of started to play around with this idea of what I call holoploigy. This word comes, it's based in ancient Greek, and holy meaning holistic or complex, and then rather than gogy, so we've got things like pedagogy, which some people use as a way of uniting curriculum, teaching, learning and assessment. Some people talk about andragogy, hertagogy. The problem with gogy is it means to lead, and therefore even though some people use, say, pedagogy within HE, that actually just means to lead children. Well, we're not working with children, and I don't see my job within HE as being something that leads. I'm not leading someone. But what I do think we're doing, hopefully, is navigating. We're navigators. What that means is that at some points we're actually very much involved, very much the people leading the process, helping other people understand the terrain, helping other people understand how they can begin to navigate through that terrain themselves. So we're taking a very leading role, lecturing, direct instruction of sorts, whatever it might be. But at other times we want people to go away and practice those navigation skills. We want people to be able to go out into that terrain and navigate into parts of that terrain that perhaps even we don't know particularly well, but always with the proviso that we can bring them back close if we need to ensure that their skills and also their understanding of the terrain is coherent. I think Gert Biester has a very important point in a recent paper that he had published, that one of the problems with making HE particularly an economic relationship is that then there is a tendency for lecturers to ask students what they want and give them the things that they believe that they want, which is the wrong kind of relationship. It should be a professional relationship where the lecturer's expert is saying to the student, actually, if you want a coherent understanding of this subject, you need these various things. These are actually important, and therefore for at least some of the time I'm actually going to decide for you what areas of the subject you need to look at, so that you begin to have a coherent understanding. So holoploigy at base is about the complex series of relationships between students and tutors in terms of working closely with them on occasion, knowing when to back off, knowing when to allow them further away, etc., etc. And the kind of sort of diagram that I've created tries to capture this, in that at the center of it is this interpenetrating series of processes through curriculum, teaching, learning and assessment, but that those make no sense by themselves without tutors and students being at the center of the process to bring them alive, to work with those ideas and concepts to actually create an educative experience, but one that changes over time, that at different points in time that whole complex system may look different. And then sitting around that are a whole series of other processes, concepts and ideas that are actually really important in informing those central relationships and processes. And and which actually begin to give some more detailed idea on how they might fit together. Always remembering that with any complex adaptive system, as Cilliers would argue, you can never capture it in its entirety. It's impossible, because if you created a model that included everything, the model would have to be as big as reality itself, and that's just not possible. It will always be a partial indicative model of how things might work. And the kind of definition for holoploidy that I've come up with is this idea, therefore, of an emergent enactment of the processes of educative experiences. Emergent in the sense that we don't always know exactly where they're going to go, how people are going to make sense of it, how they might begin to bring out elements of specialist knowledge we didn't expect. Is based on the complex interaction of curriculum, teaching, learning and assessment as enacted by tutors and students. And all of these things, as the blue part of the model suggests, is mediated through things such as philosophies and different contexts, the use and creation of research. And that through all of these various complex processes, you get emergent processes that foster growth of expertise in both tutors and students. It's just the kind of expertise that's emergent may be different for different individuals. For tutors, it might be more about how you make sense of these systems and use them to greater effect. For students, it might be more about the subject content and skills and employability, whatever it might be. So what does this require? I think from an organisational change perspective, if we're going to create these kinds of environments, then actually we need to perhaps try to manage less and in a sense lead more, but lead in a way that allows people room to do things. Streetfield's book in 2001 on the paradox of control is all about the idea that the best leaders are those who are in control and not in control at the same time, hence why it's a paradox. It's those people who can set a positive environment, set a positive context, but accept that once that's up and running, they then can't micromanage it to death, because if they attempt to, the whole thing falls apart, becomes stifled, becomes a closed system that decays rather than grows. And emergence itself, based on Davis and Samara's work, uses these ideas that if we're going to bring wider organisational change, we need to have a diversity of different approaches, so that people are trying out lots of different things, but accepting that people might try out similar things at the same time, but they might be in slightly different contexts, that by trying different things out, there's going to be redundancy. Things are going to be tried that don't work out and fall away. But that's absolutely fine. That allows you to specialise towards the things that really do work in the different contexts in which you work over time. Also, that within any large organisation, any individual can never be wholly aware of what's happening across the whole organisation. It's too big, and therefore we tend to work through sort of near neighbour interactions, that it's actually working, say, with people in our own department, with our own faculty, but then finding ways of trying to get those messages out more widely. But as we're developing them with the people around us, or the people with whom we've started to create various networks. And therefore, you have to have decentralized control. You can't have 2 or 3 people at the top of an organization trying to micromanage. But importantly, this kind of change can't be chaotic. Well, it can be chaotic, but obviously then it won't work. So one of the ways of trying to ensure that there's some structure, we're talking about complexity, not chaos, is that you create coherence by actually putting boundaries around the change that you're trying to create. So it might be around sort of saying, well, you know, we want people to work on one of these 4 areas, or we want people to work with these particular groups of students, so that there are actually boundaries that create a level of coherence. But within those boundaries, you have free rein to try things out that you professionally think will work. So there's a level of randomness in there as well. which basically mean then you have enabling constraints that stops people from spinning off in whatever direction they want, but also gives them the professional freedom to really begin to play around with really interesting ideas and see what comes from the work that they do. And therefore we need different kinds of organizational environments. I would argue that a lot of educational environments still, or a lot of organizations are very mechanistic, hierarchical. Planning is seen as something which is central, so a lot of the change is linear. It's all about particular projects driven from the top, which means that the conversations are dictated. Teachers to an extent, or lecturers, are seen as technicians. It's all about using lots of numeric data, and therefore is information led and also evaluation led. And as a consequence of all of this, what we're trying to do is bring a high level of certainty, but actually what that does more than anything else is leads to decay. It actually prevents the emergence of fantastic new practice, because everybody's having to work within particular straitjackets, some of which they may feel are actually predicate against them doing something useful within their own context. And again, as mentioned earlier, where a lot of this is happening, you get this notion of hyper-accelerated standstill, where people are so busy they don't actually do anything. And that potentially then leads to something I've characterized in the past as zombie innovation, where in a lot of large organizations in education, one of the things that I both see and have been told about through others' experience is that the people at the top send down change structures into the organization. The people at the bottom are so busy doing so much that they've become very adept at sending the right kind of information back up the hierarchy whilst actually changing nothing. So you can get people at the top of the organization who think they're going through lots of transformative change. It's all great, it's all positive, so they're happy, and that the people at the bottom just basically just don't do it, and therefore it's never embedded. So basically the innovation then staggers around at times for years in the twilight between the top and the bottom of the organization, never alive through day-to-day practice, but also never dead because the people at the top think that it's happened. And that's actually very damaging, and I think that's because organizations attempt to do far too much in any given amount of time. An ecological approach is very, very different. It works more on networks than hierarchies. It accepts that at least some, if not the majority of innovation may actually, and organizational change may be emergent and non-linear, rather than people being dictated to. It's about a community process of creating narratives through having a dialogic space, and rather than evaluations at the end of processes, bringing in more sense making, which is about trying to understand complex processes and perhaps affecting change whilst you're actually involved within the change itself. That rather than hyper accelerated, you have less large scale change within the organization, and instead go for particular things that are important, but actually spend time on reflection and dialogue and emergence, so that the whole process becomes communal rather than individualistic. But as a consequence of that, it's also about embracing risk, saying that it's okay for people to try something out, even if it's risky. And if it doesn't work, as long as you've had a good intent and a good plan and an expectation of success, if it doesn't work, well, okay, that's part of the redundancy element of emergence. You just stop doing it because it doesn't work, and you go on to try something else. So how do we make time for change? I think first of all, we've just got to accept that first of all, I think we have to accept that we need to understand the processes of change far better, and not assume that they can be done by diktat, which seems to be one of the major ways that change is introduced at present. But also we've got to be honest with ourselves and accept that real change is actually very, very difficult to create. As I've sort of already said, in terms of zombie innovation, we're very good at play acting change. we can say the right things. If somebody comes down to talk to us, we can say the right things. If they come down to watch us teach, we can do the right things. And as soon as they've gone away, we revert to what we were doing before, because the lived reality is so often different to the pieces of paper that we have to fill in. So actually bringing real change is very, very difficult. In some ways, the way that we begin to do that is to do things, in my opinion, doing things like reclaiming slow time. Erickson wrote a brilliant book a few years ago called The Tyranny of the Moment, which is all about the idea that over time we've allowed our working week to just be invaded and infected by fast time, answering emails, filling in lots of bits of accountability paperwork, or bits of paperwork to make sure that everything is done in exactly the right way. That's fine to an extent, but once you get beyond a particular tipping point, there's so much fast time during the week that you never ever get time to carve out slow time. And it's slow time where you can deliberate, reflect, discuss, create dialogic spaces, begin to write or create. You can't do those things in fast time, and yet we're swamping organisations with activities that rely on fast time. Real change takes professionalism and expertise. That means there has to be an acceptance from further up organisations that teachers, lecturers aren't sort of a bit, daft and need to be led and need to be shown the right way of doing things, that actually they have a huge amount of professionalism and expertise and actually need to be given the space to allow them to use that professionalism, very much like the professional capital message from Hargreaves and Fullan. It therefore means that we need some of that time also to begin building networks, working in new ways within our own organisations, but also beyond them. And building networks takes time, and building networks can feel as if they're inefficient because there has to be a level of interpersonal discussion just to get to know people, to understand where people are coming from. It isn't a quick process. It's not one of those things where you can sort of say, oh, we need more networks, so we'll have half a day, or we'll do a bit of speed dating talking about our interests or anything like that, because they're all predicated on this idea that you can very quickly create networks in no time at all, because you might have shared interest. Well, actually, if the network's going to last, if it's going to have any depth to it, it does take time. And also, in trying to bring about change, accepting actually that failure is part of risk taking and failure is part of change, whereas some organizations seem to operate through a tick list mentality and through a mentality of fear, so that people actually then are not willing to take risk. So rather than chasing medals, rather than chasing baubles and nice bits of data, actually, if we're going to really create a fantastic shift in practice and really create something special, then what we need to do is spend a longer amount of time building insight, building knowledge, building praxis, building networks, so that it doesn't just remain in single classrooms or seminar rooms, building ways in which people can work communally, so that we can begin to create momentum on a wider scale in terms of the change that we're looking for. And I think one way of doing that, it's not the only way, but one way of doing that is through greater use of sense making. And I use the version of sense making that comes from a blog. You've got the reference there by Snowden. So sense making is the ability or attempt to make sense of an ambiguous situation. More exactly, sense making is the process of creating situational awareness and understanding in situations of high complexity or uncertainty in order to make decisions. It is a motivated, continuous effort to understand connections in order to anticipate their trajectories and act effectively. It's an ongoing process. So when we're trying to understand what I would call our polyploidic environments, our learning environments, what we're attempting to do ultimately is bring in some kind of continuous process that helps us develop what we're doing in real time, so that rather than say, I teach a lot of master students, rather than sort of saying, oh, we'll do some evaluations at the end of the year, that'll be useful. And then when the end of the year comes, the evaluations tell you that if you'd done something 6 months previous, it would have been really useful. You know, you're in a position of saying to students, well, thanks ever so much for your feedback, we'll make sure that next year's lot get a better deal than you did. What we need is a process or a series of processes that allow us to understand where we are in real time and make changes, make adjustments as we go along. So just an example of this, I think, has to come along from the idea of using mixed methods approaches. So what you have here is just a very simple outline of an idea that I will be using in the autumn with my master's students, where we want to use a number of different approaches to get a very enriched idea of their experience, the processes that they're engaging with, their learning as they move through the master's course that I teach on. And to do this, we have to use a mixed methods approach, because whilst I think organizations have become fixated with numeric data. Numeric data is incredibly important. It's just it's got to be the right kind of numeric data. And it's got to be using the numeric data in the right kind of way. I think one of the problems is that we use lots of numeric data and it's all outcome data. We should be using numeric data diagnostically. So what I've suggested here, just as several things that we'll end up using, I think, is learning analytics, using learning analytics from students work online, getting an idea of how they're using resources, the extent to which they're using resources, data mining, text mining. So actually using text mining on some of their written work, just to sort of begin to see some of the patterns within that. And then using those numbers to feed into more qualitative approaches, such as interviewing, focus groups, looking to use questionnaires on a fairly regular basis, student work and feedback and feed forward. We might even use sort of at various points during the year social network analysis to try to understand how they're developing their network, how they're developing their ecologies of learning over the course of the year. But it's by using a number of different techniques that we can begin to build a far richer sense of how they're experiencing, but also getting feedback from them so that we can actually keep changing and tweaking what we're doing on the course. And so that actually not only are we getting a much deeper understanding of teaching, we're also getting a much deeper, hopefully, understanding of the way that they're learning, how the curriculum's operating, what other elements are developing, how we're developing as practitioners. And the added bonus to all of this is that there's huge amounts of research potential in there as well. So once we've got all of that data, we need to create opportunities for dialogic space-time, both as a team to discuss what's happening, but also with the students, bringing in them as equal partners in actually beginning to understand the environment in which they're working. And doing all of this in contextually relevant ways and using relevant structures so that we get this emergent process. And what I think this kind of approach then allows is, first of all, to get away from sort of dull-headed notions of things like performance management, where you sit down once a year and sort of say, these were my targets, have I met them? Yes, I have. Aren't I wonderful? Right, we'll move on next year and I'll see you in another 12 months time. What this allows is professional growth dialogues. It allows people to be in a process of growth throughout the year, and perhaps in some ways almost dispense with the idea of performance management, because actually, first of all, it's very narrow. If you have performance management, it allows people actually to not take responsibility for what they're doing, because all they'll do is turn around to you and say, well, I've met my targets, what's your problem? So sort of dialogic professional growth is actually a much wider process and actually asks more of people, but it does so in a very professional kind of way. And then finally, what it also means is that we can begin as a team to move away from in a sense, again, annual strategic planning. It becomes an emergent plan throughout the year. In fact, it doesn't even have to be over a year. It's just an emergent plan that keeps on going. You're constantly thinking about how you can make it better over lots of different time scales. Some might be longer than a year, some a lot shorter. Rather than having these fixed strategic plans that organisations often have, that actually they revisit, say, once a year, it can actually become redundant within 3 months. It might get to the end of a year and it hasn't been long enough. And there's also that feeling with annual plans that they in some ways they just become really sort of dressed up adverts for the organisation rather than doing sort of some really hard work. Another approach which could be taken is what I'm calling a holoploidic studio. So the idea of holoploidy, much wider than a teaching unit, teaching and learning unit, because it's about so much more. But it's about trying to take that sort of course level sense making approach and bring it to a much bigger scale within an organization. So it has to be transdisciplinary, deliberately working with teams of experts who have different worldviews, as long as they're open-minded enough to accept that other people may have different worldviews and may be equally useful in many ways. That sort of pragmatic view. Rather than just sort of going into a discussion saying, oh, I'm a positivist or I'm an interpretivist and therefore you're wrong. Building contextually driven dialogues, so thinking about what's happening with the organisation and driving dialogues through that context. Creating rich rhizomes of understanding and application, trying to create networks of understanding and application across the organisation by working in a number of different areas. And really importantly, focusing on dissemination and support for others. So it would be, the reason I've called it a studio is that I hate words like laboratory, observatory, because it makes it sound like people are divorced and taking a very narrow approach to something. This is a studio, there's creativity, there's trying things out, but it's all based around creating rich tapestries of evidence, if you like. But part of that is actually then disseminating and supporting others, using some of your time not only to understand and develop, but also to go and work out with people to embed and establish. And therefore it has to be process, not target led. And through doing this, I think we begin to dissolve some of the damaging, bizarre notions of the theory practice gap, which I've got to say doesn't exist in my mind anyway. I think to suggest there's a theory practice gap in many ways particularly is to misunderstand theory. So the diagram shows this idea of it being transdisciplinary, about change over time and space, about complexity and process, and then looking at a whole series of different processes from pedagogy all the way up to aims and philosophies at a very large scale, and using lots of different approaches, including things like quasi-experiments and big data. It has to be a mixture, and that richness is very much in keeping with this notion of a holoploidic approach. So some final thoughts really. I think that the headline is that we've tried managerialism for 30 years and we've got to ask ourselves what it's achieved. It may have achieved a certain amount of standardization. It's certainly achieved an education sector where leaders are particularly good at, or many leaders are particularly good at reading what politicians want and then just gerrymandering the system to suit. What I find interesting recently over the last few years is the way then that politicians say that that's all about game playing. Well, are you surprised that's the system you've created? You know, it's a bit rich really. And I would argue that really what we've ended up with is a system that is basically broken. It's a system that's constantly looking for quick, easy wins. It's a system that's wanting to ensure that you've got a few numeric indicators right, rather than looking at the complexity of how you move your organisation forward. And therefore we need new ways of working. We need new ways to understand and enable change, and we need new ways to understand and enable fantastic practice. And in education, I think we've got to get rid of this idea of philosopher kings. And what we actually need to do is move from seeing leadership as being central to actually seeing leadership as being subordinate to organisation, but still incredibly important. As I sort of said before, within organisational sciences, looking at how it's about the organisation with the leadership as an element of that, rather than leadership here and organisation and workers over there. I would argue more widely that we're seeing a paradigm of complexity gathering pace, and it's certainly one that I would advocate as somebody who really sees much of what I'm doing through a lens of complexity theory. It's beginning to take hold in economics, international development, obviously within science itself. Has been for 40 years within science. So complexity is gathering pace as an alternative paradigm to the reductive materialism and neoliberalism that we've seen over the last 30 or 40 years. But we still have to ask questions of whether it is the way forward, or are there other ways forward as well. It comes back to the original comment I made, that actually what we need is a lot of different imaginations, a lot of new ways of taking stuff forward that are different to the mainstream, to see what eventually works. I think within a complexity paradigm, we then need to re-establish within education that it has to be about collaboration and community rather than individualism. And I think that's where many of the groundswell changes amongst teachers with things like teach meets and teacher-led conferences is actually a reaction to the official individualism that has been established, particularly amongst sort of the ways that leaders have to work and the way that government works, by creating that collaboration and community as really just the only way forward for making people's life bearable, but also bringing fantastic practice. Within that, then we need to think about the fact that positive change, real embedded change, at least in part comes from dialogic space-time, that actually we need opportunities to have dialogue, we need opportunities to share and to discuss and to create if we're going to do something brilliant. And that means that we have to take away a lot of the sort of dead accountability structures, idiotic managerialism that actually keeps people busy but achieves very, very little. And finally, I think that what underlies a lot of this philosophically is that in doing these different things, what we have to actually accept is that we're painting an incomplete complexity. We can never understand and see and develop the full complexity in any organisation, because much of it is hidden, much of it is implicit, much of it you can't actually get a grasp of. But is it better to paint the incomplete complexity, or to believe that we understand our organisations phenomenally well through a series of numbers, which ends up just being working with the shadows? Now, I would argue it's better to be honest, to have humility, and to work with the incomplete complexity. That's half the fun, than to try to get everybody to believe that we have this sort of amazing understanding by looking at a few numbers. These are just some references and related publications which may be of interest and have been important for me in terms of developing some of these ideas.